1962. Wilt Chamberlain allegedly scores exactly 100 points against the New York Knicks. Wilt averaged more than 50 points per game that season, scoring over 4,000 points for the Philadelphia Warriors. He's the only player to ever cross either of those thresholds, and odds are, that ain't gonna change. For his first 7 seasons, he averaged basically 40 points per game. He put up so many statistical records that will never be broken that it is legitimately difficult to count. His team must have just been dominating everyone they faced, right? They must have been unstoppable. So let's check the record. Wilt would go on to... Oh God, what? 8 fewer points per game in the playoffs. First and second round exits. Wait, he didn't even win MVP? He missed the playoffs, averaging 45 points a game? How does a player average 45, play every minute of all 80 games, and lose 18 more games than they won? Maybe he just had poor help. That's gotta be it. Let me check. Multiple all-star teammates? What is happening here? Wilt Chamberlain was not only one of the most talented and prolific hoopers of all time, but he was also surrounded by all-star level help. And he can't finish the job? Why? I mean, we can see the footage, or at least the footage that's out there. We've probably heard the stories, and we've definitely seen that picture of a young Wilt grinning and flashing a big 100 to the camera. But despite what our eyes might make us think, the version of Wilt Chamberlain who was the greatest of the great, the Wilt who was putting up near impossible stat lines, was actually the biggest loser. Welcome to NBA Deep Dive. Thank you to the sponsor of this video, Fabletics. This month's haul features outerwear that you can wear anywhere. It arrived just in time for a cold front and has been keeping me cozy ever since. Fabletics quality kinda feels obvious by now, but in case you don't already know, wearing Fabletics means feeling the comfort and support that comes with long-lasting, well-fitting clothes. Their moisture-wicking, anti-odor, and 4-way stretch technologies keep me feeling fresh. Plus, their monthly drops keep my closet stocked with stylish, functional fits from casual to active wear. If that sounds like it's for you, then go to fabletics.com/rusty and become a VIP to get access to exclusives like up to 50% off all products, early access to styles, and free access to the Fabletics Fit app. And when you use my link, fabletics.com/rusty, then you get awesome offers that are just for new VIPs, like 80% off of your first purchase, including jackets. As a VIP, you can use your member credit to redeem a 2-piece set or any product up to $100 every single month. And if you want to skip a month, you can do so as often as you like, and you won't be charged. Just skip between the 1st and 5th of the month. So to tap in, become a VIP, get some of the best clothes in the game, and 80% off of your first purchase, check out the link in the description or go to fabletics.com/rusty. And again, that's fabletics.com/rusty, and thank you to Fabletics for sponsoring this video. Wilt Chamberlain is not a story of a humble rise to stardom. No, the dude just had a growth spurt and from there was like comically dominant against everybody else. He was already a natural athlete, super fast, he had a really high vertical leap, and he was naturally quite strong. Then you add on to it that he was nearly 7 feet tall in high school. Yeah, like I said, comical levels of dominance. In college, after being required to be on a freshman-only team in year 1, in his first game playing varsity in his second year, he broke Kansas's record for points and rebounds, scoring 52 points and grabbing 31 boards. He wouldn't win a championship this season, falling just short, and in the following, they wouldn't even get a shot at it. Wilt wanted to make some money for his play, so he dropped out of college, not to go to the NBA, but to join the Harlem Globetrotters. He got a quick payday from them, but he ultimately had his sights set on the NBA. The Philadelphia Warriors would take Wilt with a territorial pick. Territorial picks were a weird quirk in the early NBA that allowed teams to essentially call dibs on players who lived near the franchise. Wilt was so coveted that he would end up signing the biggest contract in the NBA as a rookie for $30,000 a year, which is $320,000 in today's money. This isn't a ton by today's standards, but like, come on, man. We hadn't even made it to the moon at this point. He also got $50K from the Globetrotters and $10K just for publishing an article about leaving college, so the dude knew how to get a bag. Chamberlain would end up being the NBA's golden goose for marketing, drawing a ton of attention with his super flashy numbers and utter physical dominance. As a rookie, Wilt averaged 37 points and 27 rebounds over 72 regular season games. Of those 72, he played the entire game 42 times, including 2 that went into overtime, and rested for just 5 minutes or less in all but 5 games. His points, rebounds, and minutes per game averages are all rookie records that still stand to this day. The word record is one that you're going to hear a lot in relation to Wilt. One of his nicknames is literally Record Book. He has 5 of the 10 highest scoring rookie games and 8 of the 10 highest rebounding rookie games. He was so good as a rookie that he won the freaking MVP award. But with those big numbers and awards and his 3 all-star teammates, Wilt would lose in the Eastern Divisional Finals to Bill fucking Russell. Wilt would average 7 fewer points in this series than in the regular season, and he'd put up just 26 in the closeout game, where the Celtics beat the Philadelphia Warriors by 2 points, 119 to 117. This would become the prevailing theme of Wilt's career for quite a while. Wilt would put up video game numbers, just some shit that's hard to even conceptualize, just to lose to a guy who scores 15 points a game. And it's not like Wilt was just a pure bucket getter. The guy was a rebounding phenom, and the only reason he wasn't the best defender in the NBA on top of that is because Bill fucking Russell was there. Where Wilt would ultimately falter by contrast to Russell was in his playmaking, leadership, and maturity. Things that don't seem as important as scoring 37 might, but ultimately, these things were the reason Russell always prevailed in these matchups. Now, the common narrative is that Bill just had significantly more help. That's not true. While it's inarguable that Bill had great help in his career, Wilt was never burdened by bad teammates, more so bad franchises and poor relationships with head coaches and even owners. Russell ultimately had the advantage where he was in Boston, but not to a degree that explains this utter dominance, and not to a degree that explains Wilt's playoff droppage. There's more than one reason that Wilt is called the Big Dipper. It's also worth mentioning that it's not as though these were unwinnable matchups for Wilt. In his rookie year, he took Boston to 6 games, and Game 6 was decided by 2 points. That's a winnable series if Wilt doesn't underperform in that game. Going into his second season, Chamberlain averaged 38, but they got swept in round 1 by the Syracuse Nationals, a team that had 8 more losses in the regular season than Philly. Then, in the 61-62 season, his infamous 50-point-per-game season, the Warriors won just 49 games with him and 2 other All-Stars, while Boston won 60 with Russell averaging just 19 points. The Warriors and the Celtics would meet in the divisional finals once again. The series would go to 7 games. Game 7 would be determined by just 2 points, just like in 1960. And Wilt underperformed. By a lot. He was outscored by a guy named Tom Meskery, a rookie from Harbin, China, who had put up an average of 12.1 points that season. Let me repeat that. Prime Wilt Chamberlain, who averaged 50 points per game during the regular season, was outscored by a rookie who was typically putting up 12 points per night. Tom Meskery had 32 points. Wilt only put up 22 points in an elimination game the season that he averaged 50. To put that into proper perspective, in the regular season, he scored below 25 points exactly 0 times. Following this depressing loss at the end of a historic season, the Warriors were so ashamed that they moved from Philadelphia to San Francisco. And unfortunately for Wilt, his best teammates didn't make the move with them, opting for trades elsewhere or just outright retiring. As a result, he played without all-star help for the first time, and despite averaging 45 points per game, the Warriors missed the playoffs. Now I understand that his help wasn't good, and the franchise was undergoing a lot of changes. But missing the playoffs, averaging 45 and 24? Come on, bro, something here is fishy. The following year, they would make the playoffs with a bit more stability. Wilt scored a career-low 36.9 points per game. Wow, talk about falling off. But he averaged 5 assists, a career high by a large margin. This was thanks to Wilt somewhat listening to the Warriors' new coach, Alex Hannum. In this marginally reduced role, with a few all-stars around him yet again, Wilt Chamberlain would for the first time lead his team to the NBA Finals. But that was probably because he didn't have to get through Bill Russell to get there. Unfortunately for him, Bill was waiting in the finals. This time around, it wasn't close, so I can't give Wilt shit for underperforming in a closeout game. I can, however, point out that yet again, he averaged 8 less points per game than in the regular season. The season after that, once again, San Francisco was terrible. In the 38 games that Wilt played with them in 1964, they won just 10 of those games. He would get traded to the newly established Philadelphia 76ers at the 1964 trade deadline, so he was back in Philly just under a new franchise. Unfortunately, this wasn't a great fit at first, as Philly's head coach was Dolph Schayes, a rival player from earlier in Wilt's career. Luckily, the roster was really talented, with all-star two-guard Hal Greer, versatile all-star forward Chet Walker, all-star double-double big Luke Jackson, and just an offseason later, Rookie of the Year runner-up and future multiple-time All-Star Billy Cunningham. As stacked as the roster was, this didn't really work initially. Wilt actually held back his teammates from their full potential, now that he was taking such a big piece of the pie that they were previously getting. As a whole, the roster improved because Wilt is Wilt at the end of the day, but they were better on paper than in practice. Still, they managed to make it to yet again another Game 7 versus Russell's Celtics, and yet again they lost, this time by just 1 point. So that makes 3 series now, where the final game of the series was defined by 1 or 2 points. You could view that as bad luck, or you can view it as the flaws of this playstyle holding back the potential that Wilt had. Yeah, what he was doing was almost enough, but you can't build a career on almosts. And if his play was a little more team-oriented, not only should Wilt be able to beat the Celtics, he should be able to dominate them like no other. My honest take about Wilt versus Russell is that Wilt should have been a better player than Russell, and should have had more success against him. But for reasons beyond just pure talent, that just wasn't the case. Or at least, it wasn't all but 1 year. In one season, Wilt Chamberlain peaked higher than Russell ever did, and by a substantial margin at that. It wasn't after this second heartbreaking Game 7 loss to Bill. He had to lose to him one more time to change his ways. Philly was much better having Wilt for the full season, and he won MVP as a result, ending a 6-year drought after winning it in his rookie year. Unfortunately, Bill Russell spoiled it by beating him 4-1, holding Chamberlain to 5 fewer points per game than his regular season average. But in the offseason of 1966, the Philadelphia 76ers fired head coach Dolph Schayes and replaced him with Alex Hannum, who had coached Wilt for the one successful season he had in San Francisco. In Coach Hannum's first meeting with the team, he told them everything he thought was wrong with their approach in the previous season, and there was a common theme in each critique he listed. The source of them all tracked back to Wilt Chamberlain. Teammates ended up having to hold Wilt back from attacking Hannum, but Alex stood his ground and stood by what he said. Apparently, this ended up earning Wilt's respect. He convinced Wilt to score the ball less and pass to his teammates more, and as a whole, focus his energy more on the defensive end of the floor. This resulted in the best season of Wilt's career, the peak of his abilities as a basketball player. Now, I realize you might look at a 50-point per game season and say, how is him averaging half of that a better season? Let me describe 1967 Wilt Chamberlain for you. First of all, by all accounts, this was his peak defensively. Not where he racked up the most blocks, but when he actually played his best defense. The Defensive Player of the Year award wasn't around in the 60s, but if it was, it would have been Wilt's this season. His previous peak of 5.2 assists a game was now outshined by his 7.8 assists. A hell of a jump in that stat considering his minutes actually went down. 7.8 assists was the most a center had ever averaged to that point in NBA history. He was just third in assists this year behind Guy Rodgers and Oscar Robertson, who were both point guards. His ranking in assists a game amongst centers is slowly slipping away thanks to Nikola Jokic and Domantas Sabonis, but for a while, this season and the one following it was at the top of that record book. This distribution from Wilt resulted in a phenomenal offense from Philadelphia. They were number one in the league, averaging 2.8 more points per game than the second best offense, and they had a 3% better field goal percentage than the second most efficient team. This is actually the first time Wilt was a part of the number one offense in the NBA. Yes, even when he averaged 50 points per game, the Philadelphia Warriors were ranked 4th in offense. Mind you, that's out of 9 teams, so that's essentially middle of the pack. When he averaged 45 points, they had the same ranking. Now, the reason Philly's offense was phenomenal wasn't just 2.6 more assists from Wilt, rather it was what that represented, which was Chamberlain not looking for his shot, but a good shot, regardless of who got it. This meant passing to his teammates more, yeah, but most importantly, it meant taking less bad shots. Wilt attempted 10 fewer field goals this year than he did the season prior. These shots were now given to his teammates. Remember, this roster is more or less the same as last year, but multiple players saw improvements to their numbers with this new playstyle. Chet Walker, Billy Cunningham, Wally Jones, and Luke Jackson all averaged 4 more points per game than in the previous season. All of these guys were key players playing big minutes next to Wilt in the previous season. They were just as capable of this back then. The only thing that has changed is a new philosophy. And with the 10 less shots available per game, Wilt naturally just took less bad ones, only shooting the ball when he was open or had a really good advantage, playing patiently waiting for the best opportunities. His field goal percentage jumped from 54% to 68%, which was by far the most efficient of his career and led the league by far. So he as a whole averaged 24 points, 24 rebounds, nearly 8 assists, and played the best defense of his career. All of this while leading his team to 68 wins, which was an NBA record at that time and still one of the best in history. Wilt has been an unstoppable force in so many ways during regular seasons, resulting in these ludicrous box scores. So unstoppable that if he wanted 50, he got 50. But that extra scoring wasn't being added on top of what his teammates were capable of. Instead, it was taking away from what they were capable of, resulting in these mediocre offenses. With the same roster, Wilt went from 25 field goal attempts a game to just 14, but the Sixers' offense improved with his teammates going from 95.3 points a game to 101.5. That's what they did in the regular season though. There would still be a test waiting for them in the conference finals with Bill's Celtics, a test that Wilt had failed time and time again. But this time, much like the third time I took my college math class, he finally passed. Actually, I'm just kidding. Not about Wilt. I dropped out, which is kind of passing. Luckily, Wilt didn't kinda pass. He did so with flying colors. They didn't just beat Boston, they kinda kicked their ass. A gentleman's sweep where in Game 5, Philly beat them by 24 points. For the series as a whole, Wilt ended up averaging less points on worse shooting. Dude's just incapable of not scoring less against Bill, apparently. However, unlike in the past, this didn't matter at all. In the 1966 playoffs versus Boston, the Sixers starters scored 84 points per game and got gentlemen swept. This year, while Wilt's scoring went down significantly, it was more than made up for by the massive spike in point production by the other four guys on the floor, going from scoring 56 of those 84 points per game to 82.6 of their 104.2. And this time, the Sixers were the ones who did the gentleman sweeping versus Boston, the only team to beat the Celtics in a playoff series for the entire 60s, and the only time Wilt ever overcame Bill Russell. Quite the stark contrast. He also made up for slightly worse scoring with even more rebounding than normal, averaging 30, and he outright dominated as a playmaker, averaging 10 assists per game. So for the series where he finally eclipsed Russell, he averaged 21 points, 30 rebounds, and 10 assists. What a stat line. Wilt finally did it. Not by scoring 50 every night, but by playing team basketball. He and his teammates put an end to a streak of 8 consecutive years of Boston winning the title. Following this season, Wilt would perform similarly to the year prior, actually averaging more assists and even leading the league in total assists. He ended up taking 2 more shots a game while shooting worse from the field, however, and he actually had a lot of off-court distractions as he was going through a legal dispute with the team's owner. Wilt would win MVP despite this, but the offense managed to slip a bit with Wilt being less efficient and also being kind of too assist hungry. Like he learned entirely the wrong lessons and decided to just spam assists instead of points. That, combined with Boston's edge coming back after finally taking an L, and they ended up losing in the Eastern Conference Finals in 7. But it does get worse. They blew a 3-1 lead, as Wilt played, well, awful in the last 3 games, averaging 21 points on 41% shooting. In Game 7, Boston won by just 4 points. He scored only 14. I do feel the need to mention a piece of historical context here. This series actually went down right after Martin Luther King was murdered by definitely not the CIA. So many of the players on both sides of these divisional finals, as well as across the league as a whole, were understandably in a dark place mentally. They needed time to grieve and time to heal, but unfortunately, the season trudged on anyways. Following this series loss, Alex Hannum decided to leave Philly for the West Coast to be closer to family, and Wilt, having lost the coach who steered him in the right direction, and constantly being in opposition to the ownership, asked to be traded specifically to the Lakers, as he thought his celebrity had grown beyond Philly and he would feel more at home in LA. And he got what he asked for. With the Lakers, Wilt would eventually win another title in 1972, this time against those New York Knicks that he allegedly dropped 100 on 10 years before. But he never again would have a season resembling that of 1967. Chapter 2. Numbers versus Facts. A paradox is more than just the shoes a hot goth girl wears. It's also a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. In this case, it's not actually the person Wilt Chamberlain was. Instead, it's a thing that we're talking about. Not Wilt himself, but his legacy, his legend, and how people discuss that legend. In my view, when people talk about Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball player, they talk about him outside of the context of a team, as though he was an individual force, and most importantly for this discussion, that's when he was at his best. Wilt, the one-man team. 50 points per game is such a hilariously high number that people just say that rather than go into how he was also a loser for most of his career. But the reality is, there is no such thing as a one-man team. At least, no such thing as a successful one on the biggest stage. Now, you might think that that was untrue at this time in NBA history. You know, like basketball is so primitive at this time that all you need is one real superstar. But that's clearly not the case when you look at the success of the Celtics. Bill Russell might have a handful of MVPs to his name, but Boston found its success through assembling a good NBA roster around their superstar player. The Warriors in Philly and San Francisco managed to put multiple all-star teammates next to Wilt, sure, but none of them were elevated by him or their coach's system. They were star players despite Wilt's presence, not because of it. Contrast that to Russell's Celtics. There are dudes in the Hall of Fame right now almost entirely because Bill Russell was their teammate. And you just can't say that for Wilt for basically his whole career. A big reason why that particular player rivalry is so often discussed and evokes passionate opinions despite us being decades and decades removed from their reign over the basketball world is because these two represent entirely different basketball philosophies. Wilt represents indulgence in superstar play, a one-man basketball approach that is fun and flashy and ultimately impressive and deserving of credit, but seldom leads to rings. Bill represents selfless, team-oriented play where every player below him still gets a chance to shine and make a major impact. This comes at the expense of Bill's counting stats, but I think he preferred looking at the rings on his fingers over a big number on Basketball Reference. But another reason is a bit more difficult to talk about, and it's not the most relevant to our overall point in this video, so we won't go too deep into this tangent here. But the reason is how different the US was culturally at this time. There was a lot of work being done to make the world a better place in the 60s, but there was also a lot more work that needed to be done, and still does, frankly. America was an even more racist place than it is currently, and this certainly bled into the public's perception of Wilt and Bill. So yeah, lots of people in the basketball world had some atrocious opinions about these two for deplorable reasons. But as it relates to the strictly sports ideas, most folks then, and even many today, have one opinion that I actually do agree with. That being, winning matters above all. This perspective is one that has been somewhat lost over the years, as many modern fans tend to complain about quote-unquote ring culture. I've even seen memes made unironically saying that averaging 6 more points per game is better than winning a championship. But me personally, I don't care what your numbers are beyond how they help you win basketball games. And this emphasis on winning is why Russell won MVP over Wilt in 1962. Yeah, he averaged fewer rebounds and way fewer points, but his team was so much better. And Russell had already proven that he could lead his team to a championship 4 of his first 5 years in the league. So naturally, Bill got ring number 5 in '62, beating Wilt in the process. Lots of fans like to claim that this was some sort of bias against Wilt, when in reality, the voting followed a pretty consistent logic. From 59 to 65, Wilt averaged 40.6 points per game. He won MVP in his rookie year, but not another season in this 6-year sample again. His stats were real purty, but his team won 54% of their games, a cumulative record of 250 wins and 216 losses. But from 1966 to 1968, Wilt three-peated as MVP, averaging 27.3 points per game. On average, his team won 76% of the time, going 185 and 48 in that 3-year stretch, including the winningest season ever to that point, going 68 and 13 in 1967. When Wilt won games, Wilt won MVPs. But the modern revisionism of this MVP race, the notion that all these people voting in the 60s were just a bunch of damn fools for not having today's standard for the award, it's just plain wrong. The somewhat tragic part of Wilt's story is that he ended up winning MVPs and even a championship, not by playing like himself, or at least people's idea of him, but instead being more like his nemesis, Bill Russell. Now, the next question worth answering is who deserves the blame and the credit here? Was it more of an issue with Wilt's ego or just ignorant, primitive coaching in an underdeveloped basketball era? For Wilt, it was reinforcing him early that his path toward success included over 30 field goal attempts a game. In high school and college, the offense and defense was a one-man show, but it wasn't remarkably effective even at those lower levels. But despite the lack of winning, his sheer physical dominance was getting praise and the dude was getting paid. It only made sense that he would translate this playstyle to the next level, and given that he was no doubt very talented, it only made sense that his coaches would then continue to play him in this manner, and just assume that the underperformance of his teammates was merely a product of them not being good enough to hold a candle to Wilt's talent. And the thing is, all of this was mostly true. I really don't blame anyone in this equation. I can't sit here and act like if I was the coach of the Philadelphia Warriors that I would have the foresight of modern basketball principles to recognize these issues. I can make these criticisms in hindsight, but I don't know that that's fair. Instead, I'll delve out some praise for Alex Hannum and for Wilt. Now, on the ego front, there's no doubt that Wilt had a big one. Again, in the spirit of not being a total jerk about it, when I say the guy had a big ego, while you can definitely take that as a criticism, it's more of an abject reality that I think you just need to accept when it comes to these larger-than-life figures. It's not as though Bill Russell was without ego. He talked shit all the time, all the way till the end.
I would kick your ass.
And I got nothing but respect for that. What's important is that a big ego isn't allowed to overtake a franchise, that it's challenged, and that the player with that big ego can put it in check and recognize the flaws in their ways. Some players are easier to get through to than others. For some, it's not a challenge at all, and for others, it's downright impossible. Wilt had no shortage of beefs with coaches and ownership and really just about anybody that you could beef with in an NBA franchise. However, he still managed to follow Alex Hannum's lead when he needed to, and Alex was the perfect combination of multiple abilities as a coach. First and foremost, while he might not have been Wilt size, he was no pipsqueak. Dude was 6'7", and most importantly, bald. Bald, middle-aged men often have nothing to lose, and it's really terrifying. As a result, he could challenge Wilt without backing down from whatever potential physical repercussions may come from it. Many of Wilt's former coaches kind of feared the guy. He was a lifelong phenom, 7'2", charismatic, and the greatest scorer, the flashiest, most dominant player the world had ever seen. Pair that with the typical racism of the time and how front offices often saw their black superstars as moneymakers and workhorses, and it makes sense why they never wanted to switch things up. Wilt brought in fans even without titles. Wilt attracted superstar acclaim just by being Wilt. They were afraid to challenge Wilt. They were afraid to challenge anything they were doing, anything which made Wilt so great and so profitable. Whichever team Wilt was on was effectively must-see hoops, and if you're the team owner selling out your arena, why try to fix what isn't broken? Which meant that the same bad cycle of basketball continued for years and years and years. Coach Hannum's strategy wasn't just to kick things off with a list of criticisms against Wilt. He also had a game plan. Hannum recognized two important core tenets of basketball that weren't necessarily undiscovered, but definitely were not as well understood as they are today. Those being rhythm and gravity. In general, shooting was still in its early stages of development. The jump shot wasn't even a thing at basketball's inception and wasn't for many decades. Everyone was trying to get right next to the basket because the idea of launching it from that far was just insane. Clearly, that would be too difficult. Basketball was invented in 1891. And the first thing resembling a made jump shot recorded from an actual basketball game was taken by John Miller Cooper from the University of Missouri in 1930. And that did not become a prominent part of anyone's game until the 1940s, when Kenny Sailors essentially made basketball an entirely different sport. Kenny was featured in Life magazine in 1946 as the inventor of the jump shot, a smaller guy looking for a way to score the ball, and ended up making scoring in general fundamentally different. So when Wilt was drafted, jump shots had been a thing for a solid 13 years. But it's safe to say that people weren't exactly taking no-dip catch-and-shoots or creating space with step-backs off of the bounce back then. It's also safe to say that coaches really didn't know how to value these jump shots, as less than 2 decades prior, they were basically seen as a wild gimmick, a trick shot more or less. If I were to draw a parallel to another sport, it's kind of like passing the ball in football. American football, to be clear. When American football was first invented, and for the next couple of decades following it, you ran the ball. Every single time, without fail. Even after passing the ball to receivers became a prominent part of the sport, it was still very clear which was favored. Most football coaches would be either ignorant or dismissive of the potential reward of passing the football due to the increased risk factor. And you can cut and paste this logic into hoops and the J. You get the ball as close to the basket as possible, and then you attempt a shot. As a result, when jump shooting perimeter players around Wilt were getting the short end of the stick due to this approach, well, no one really cared enough to even notice until Alex Hannum did. Recognizing that by depriving these shooters of consistent touches, they weren't getting into the proper rhythm necessary to score effectively. And by getting them in rhythm, it would allow for a more dominant offense, even if technically you end up scoring a bit less in the paint. But in general, paint scoring becomes considerably easier when the defense doesn't just know you're taking it inside every time. So while the volume of paint points might decrease, the efficiency in the paint should increase when you space the floor with jump shooters. Same goes for running the football today. By passing it frequently, the defense can't simply queue up and prepare for a run on every single play. This, as well as eliminating bad shots inside, resulted in Wilt's insane efficiency in 1967. He never had as many easy looks at the rim as he did when he was finally allowing his shooters to get in rhythm. He even claimed that to specifically be his job, saying, "I have a team that is full of shooting basketball players. It is my job to keep them fluid and happy. That's the game." Adding, "I'll do whatever is necessary to win. That's what the coach wants, and that's what I want. The shooters around Wilt had a symbiotic relationship with him. It was their shooting that often freed up Wilt for easy looks, but it was also Wilt's gravity that freed them up for open looks, resulting in, well, a shit ton of open looks. Gravity is the idea that a star offensive player inherently draws the attention of the defense. This concept has been discussed a lot more ever since Steph Curry came into the fold because in his case, because of how far players end up chasing him around, it's quite obvious the attention that he draws. But gravity was always a thing. It's inherent to the sport. Some players are way too good to allow them to match up one-on-one. So, you gotta bring extra help. What's important is that this gravity is recognized and utilized to the best of the team's ability. Unfortunately, Wilt's response to double teams back in his early years was just to shoot over them, or just shoot it so fast that the second defender couldn't get there in time. And the thing is, he was so great that it worked a lot. But it doesn't work as well as an open jump shot does, or swinging it around the perimeter to find him a better look later in the possession. So by utilizing the attention Wilt drew for himself, the Sixers got open jumpers, and with those players hitting those open jumpers, teams were forced to lay off of Wilt a little bit, allowing him to score better than ever. At a lower volume, yeah, but it was far more devastating to defenses when you consider the super high efficiency. When I look at the earliest years of Wilt's career, his 40-point-per-game era, I see a broken, unevolved approach to the game. Not a player at their best, and that's where Wilt's legacy gets paradoxical. On November 4th, 1967, Wilt played against his former team, the San Francisco Warriors. He scored just 1 point alongside 18 rebounds and 13 assists. Despite Wilt scoring just a single free throw, the Sixers won by 7 points with Wally Jones, Hal Greer, and Luke Jackson combining for 83 points on 57% shooting. After the game, Wilt received criticism for this performance, which confused him quite a bit. When I was scoring up to 100 points and we were losing, everyone blamed me. Now we're winning and I'm not scoring and people are on me again. I don't know what people want. And therein lies the paradox. Wilt is criticized for not winning because of big number. So, he bring down big number and start winning. But then he gets criticized for not putting up big number like he used to. This is what people were saying back in the 60s. Now, decades removed from these events, with all context being fairly blurry to a vast majority of NBA fans, it looks like the guy just fell off, rather than Wilt adjusting his game for the better. This line of criticism continues to exist for players. They always get attacked from all angles to the point where nothing seems right. Wilt saying, "I don't know what people want," perfectly illustrates this. You said this part of my game was wrong, so I adjusted it, and now you're saying that's wrong. There is no winning on the narrative front. The unfortunate reality of being a superstar NBA player is that, one way or the other, you will be criticized. But what's most important is that history remembers you as a winner, because that's ultimately what stands the test of time. If Wilt never won a ring in his career, and especially didn't do it in his prime, like in 1967, I think people would look at him a lot differently. Think about any of the several ringless but undeniably great players in the league today. What would their image be if they had a championship to their name? The irony is that by sacrificing his numbers to win a title, it makes those higher number seasons more justified. Like, well, he did win a title, he just didn't do it when you might have expected. But had he been coached by Alex Hannum from the onset, I think we would be talking about Wilt versus Russell very differently. Rather than one always prevailing over the other besides for just that one time, in that version of history, I think these two would end up going back and forth non-stop. The true separation between them in reality is not a massive gap in talent, but opportunity. Bill Russell was thrown into the NBA with Red Auerbach as his coach immediately, and was utilized for winning to the maximum degree immediately. It took Wilt 7 years of incredible stats, but failing to hang a banner before he finally got utilized properly as a complete basketball player, and not just some one-man show. The phenomenon of Wilt Chamberlain's success happening during his most earthly statistical seasons makes for the most clear-cut example of this paradox. No one else has had such a clear correlation between winning and reduced production, and it's likely that no one else ever will. So that's why we're going to call it Wilt's paradox from here on out. But even though this phenomenon takes from his namesake, it doesn't mean it hasn't happened to lesser extremes since Wilt's 1967 season. The unfortunate part is that it becomes harder to prove given those lesser extremes, and the result of that is the criticisms I just levied against Wilt are, well, harder to come by in modern NBA discourse. The lesson Wilt taught us in '67 seems to have gotten lost due to our distance from it. Looking at the high-volume scorers who have managed to win in their careers, let's see how their numbers correlate to winning versus losing. Wilt gave us that 100-point game, so let's go one spot down in that record book and check in on the guy who got 81. In Kobe Bryant's prime from 1999 to 2013, in seasons where he made the NBA Finals, he averaged 26 points per game. In the seasons where he didn't make the finals, he averaged 29 points per game. The most prominent stretch of high-volume scoring seasons from Kobe came in the mid-2000s after the departure of Shaquille O'Neal, leading the league in scoring in 2006 and 2007, peaking at an average of 35.4 points per game. Now, by contrast to Wilt's 50, 35 a game might seem a little low, but it's important to remember the context of the era. In 1962, Wilt's Warriors averaged 125 points per game. In 2006, Kobe's Lakers averaged 99.4. Percentage of the scoring-wise, they were pretty much in the same exact ballpark. Now, notably, help was a bigger area of concern for Kobe, which is much of the reason why he shot the ball as often as he did. But just like with Wilt, that doesn't actually hold up against scrutiny. After back-to-back scoring title seasons that ended with disappointment in the playoffs, Kobe ended up asking for a trade, but LA held off on that move, with the Lakers instead opting to bring Phil Jackson back, the coach from when Kobe and Shaq won 3 straight titles, who, upon his return to the sidelines, reined in Kobe's shot-happy play style, and the Lakers got a lot better, going on to win a couple more championships Shaq-free. Many people remember this era of Lakers history like, oh yeah, Phil came back and then they traded for Pau Gasol and then they started winning. And okay, yeah, without the addition of Pau, they probably don't end up getting a title out of it, at least not 2. But what most don't remember is that Kobe actually led the Lakers to a 30-16 record before Pau ever suited up for the Lakers. When LA acquired Gasol, they were already chasing the 1 seed in an insanely competitive Western Conference. How did this happen? Well, they did swap out Smush Parker for Derek Fisher, which no doubt helped, but otherwise the roster was pretty much the same as the season prior. The difference was that Kobe stopped shooting the ball like every possession. Over this 46-game stretch pre-Pau, Kobe averaged 28.5 points, a big dip from the 31.6 from the season prior, and a major step down from the 35.4 the year before that. His usage percentage went from 38.7, the highest usage ever at that time, down to 31.4, which is 187th all time. Kobe's teammates saw big improvements to their efficiency and production, and the team was poised to win the West just because of this simple adjustment. LA's offense went from 7th and 8th best in the NBA during his scoring title seasons to the number 3 offense in the league. It's not as much of an obvious example, but when you examine it closely, you can clearly see how Kobe's later success in his career exhibits signs of Wilt's paradox. So let's take a look at Kobe's predecessor, one of, if not the greatest volume scorers of all time. The guy with the most scoring titles in NBA history, Michael Jordan. Mike is an outlier because he actually does chart really high all time in both points per game and usage percentage during his championship seasons. But even he had a lower production in the years he won than he did otherwise. While Wilt had to choose to not go for scoring titles to get real titles instead, MJ was actually able to start hanging banners while tuning his scoring down just enough for it to be meaningful, but also keep getting scoring titles while he was at it, just not by the same margin. Jordan led the league in points per game 4 times pre-winning a championship, and then did it again in each of his 6 title runs. For those first 4 in 1987 through 1990, he averaged 34.5 points per game. But in his 6 title seasons, he averaged just 30.5 points. As a whole though, like I said, dude was an outlier. I brought up usage percentage earlier, but I never really explained it. But to put it simply, it is, quote, an estimate of the percentage of teams' plays used by a player while he was on the floor, unquote. Here's the formula if you're a math nerd, but when you take a look at the all-time leaders in usage, you have to scroll for quite a while before you see the name of a player who won a title in that season. Michael Jordan in 1993 ranked 46th all-time in usage. Then you scroll down further until you see, yet again, MJ, this time in 1998 ranked 62nd, then MJ in 1996 at 78th all-time, in 97 he's 82nd, then MJ again in 91 ranked 97th, and for the first player not named MJ to win a title with super high usage, you have Giannis in 2021 ranked 117th. If you have a player with a top 100 usage rate of all time on your roster, unless his name is Michael Jordan, you will not win a championship. You might go to the finals at best, but you will inevitably face a team that is more well-balanced that doesn't need to lean so heavily on one individual player. While we're here, let's look at a modern example of Wilt's paradox, Luka Doncic. In the 2024 season, Luka posted a usage percentage of 35.98%, which placed him at 20th all time. Funnily enough to me, as a believer in Wilt's paradox, this was actually an improvement because he posted an even higher usage percentage for 3 out of his 5 All-Star seasons, with all 5 being ranked top 25 all time. These numbers are horrendous, and they are a big problem for Luka and the Mavericks. The numbers that aren't horrendous are Luka's counting stats over the last 5 seasons. There aren't many, maybe even any players ever who have had a more impressive 5-year stretch in box score averages than Luka. 30 points, just under 9 rebounds, and 9 assists. And it's not as though he's doing that with bad efficiency. He's well above league average in efficiency despite the massive amount of responsibility he has. So because those numbers look so good, people don't see much issue with them. But when we look at the 2024 finals, you see what a system like that looks like when faced with legitimate scrutiny. Now you might be thinking, whoa, Rusty, let's dial it back. Luka was injured during the finals. Can you really criticize how that series went down knowing that he was hurt? Yes, I can. Injuries don't always come out of nowhere. A lot of the time, they can be attributed to bad luck, but they also can come from the pressure on your back from carrying an entire franchise. Luka pretty consistently ends up with some kind of nagging injury, especially the deeper into the playoff run or series he goes. And if it's not an injury, then it's fatigue. Look at how he has performed historically against the Clippers. He's known for being the Clipper killer, but when it comes to the fourth quarter, that's not so much the case. Luka ends up doing so much that he's exhausted by the end of the game and therefore less effective. And when Luka is less effective, everything falls apart. His teammates don't have enough creating ability, or they're not in a good rhythm because of how much they end up not touching the ball. Some of you might also hear that and think, he just needs conditioning. Luka is just lazy. Wilt played the whole game, every game, and yeah, okay, sure, Wilt might have played 45 minutes per game in 1967. But it's 2020-something, and nobody's playing 40-plus minutes a night anymore. Either way, it's a recipe that can get you far, but not far enough. Now, with Luka, there is also the factor that's not present with the likes of MJ, Wilt, or Kobe, and that is his playmaking ability. All three of those dudes have proven at points in their careers that they're capable of being good playmakers, but none of them are generational playmaking talents like Luka. None of them can pass the rock like him. And none of them could pass like James Harden, a player that Luka often draws comparisons to. Harden and Luka are cut from the same cloth. Once you enter the realm of the high-volume scorer and high-volume playmaker, well, now you're in heliocentric territory, which is its own can of worms. But in general, if you're going to have a player dominate the ball to the degree that these guys do, you would at least want them to be really good playmakers. Where most of these cases of Wilt's paradox show themselves progressively, being mistaken to start but prevailing in the end, James Harden's case is one that developed regressively. Harden's powers peaked in terms of success when he managed to take the greatest team of all time, the Curry-KD Warriors, to a 7-game series in 2018. He was coming off of his first scoring title and his first and only MVP, and was only thwarted by the absolute best opponent possible. So it stands to reason that his playstyle, when up against less exceptional competition, could result in a championship, right? Especially when you factor in the injury factor, not for James, but for his most important teammate. In that Western Conference Finals series, Harden had another historic playmaker sharing the backcourt with him, Chris Paul. CP3 and Harden are two of the best playmakers in basketball history, and made for a hell of a duo even if Paul's numbers looked more pedestrian than when he was in his prime. But between the two shouldering the whole playmaking load for the Rockets, when Paul went down with an injury at the end of those conference finals, Harden was left to bear the whole burden on his own. Even though Houston had built a 3-2 lead, Golden State still prevailed. After this disappointing loss in 2018, Harden's scoring numbers went higher and higher, and Houston performed worse and worse. Much of this was due to Chris Paul's inability to fully bounce back from that injury, but much like the Wilt post-rookie debut, although his numbers increased, his spot in the MVP race decreased along with his team's success. So who or what is at fault here? When a player is overproducing, what factors led to that? Well, it's complicated, and it's likely best judged on a case-by-case basis. The first issue when evaluating this is that overproduction from one player can overshadow their teammates that otherwise would perform better. Bringing this back to Wilt, the guy had practically the same exact roster in 1967 that he did in '66. Those players beneath him in the pecking order weren't bad players, they just didn't have the same opportunity to prove that they were good. You can argue something similar with Kobe. The same roster besides for a point guard swap, and suddenly the Lakers are chasing the #1 seed in a super stacked West. But also, sometimes players do suck. They just do. I don't think Kobe was wrong to opt to shoot the ball instead of passing it to Smush Parker. It makes sense. I understand why Wilt, seeing that he could score more points on better efficiency than all of his teammates, opted to just shoot the ball himself. I also see why coaches thought that was a good idea. But you won't ever truly know what you've got in a player until they get the proper opportunity. Perhaps PJ Washington could have averaged 20 a game in the 2024 finals if the Mavs had a more egalitarian system. Yeah, it seems a little far-fetched, but it's not impossible. Luka's teammates shot terribly from 3 in the 2024 finals, but they also wouldn't touch the ball for super long stretches of the game. It's pretty damn difficult to get into any kind of rhythm that way. So there's 3 common reasons why a player would have too much on their plate. First is selfishness. Some players like scoring a lot. They're kind of like the guy on Call of Duty who gets a bunch of kills but never plays the objective, so his team loses, but hey, my KD looks pretty good, so whatever. The second reason is a lack of imagination from the head coach. You know, all of those memes of coaches showing their clipboard and it's just like, give the ball to LeBron? Yeah, it's that. A lot of the coaches behind overused players end up viewing them as the offense, as the system. That doesn't always mean those coaches are bad, just that this is an oversight of theirs. In the case of the coach of Luka and the Mavs in 2024, Jason Kidd, he's a fantastic defensive coach, and he brings a lot of value to Dallas for that reason. However, he doesn't seem to want to do much to get in the way of Wilt's paradox on offense. Maybe as an ex-point guard himself, he has some biases. I don't know. The final reason is bad teammates. When your help ain't shit, sometimes you just gotta put the backpack on and hope for the best. It's often all you can really do. But how do you tell which of these reasons is to blame? Well, that's not exactly easy. We are ultimately outsiders as NBA fans. To keep using the most modern example, maybe Luka wants to dominate the ball all game and he's getting in the way of Jason Kidd's all-time great offense waiting to happen. Maybe his teammates are actually a whole lot better, but Luka doing too much is holding them back. It's often impossible to actually know these things even when they are in the past. Sometimes even an autobiography or a 30 for 30 won't tell the truth. What I do know is that scoring 35 points per game, while super impressive and deserving of its due praise for that reason, isn't a winning formula. It can be used as a barometer for how incredibly talented a player is, but it doesn't hold a candle to winning in the greatness equation. And it's important that we recognize this and call it out when we see it. Letting fans over-index on box scores so much that they forget what the point of the game is in the first place isn't something I think is acceptable. The point of scoring 30 a game is to help your team win. It's not an end in itself, and to treat it as such is to fetishize the means. I don't want to kink shame, but in this case, I really have no choice. The woke box score watchers are going too far. But don't automatically blame the players, don't automatically blame his teammates, don't automatically blame the coach. Odds are it's not as simple as Luka like big number, fuck everybody else. Although he does wear the number 77, so maybe Luka just does really like big numbers. Okay, that was dumb, but you get what I'm saying. Lots of guys in the NBA have been criticized for not doing enough by contrast to those who are doing too much. Jason Tatum is the prime example of this. His numbers aren't nearly as impressive as Luka's, not even close, but operating within a system relying on his teammates and being selective with his aggressiveness all led to him being an NBA champion.
The truth about Wilt's paradox is big numbers are great, but even when it comes to a box score, there's always such a thing as too much of a good thing.
Thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you made it to this point. I recognize that your time is valuable because everybody is competing for it, including us. So thank you for allowing us to win that competition just that little bit more than we're often losing it. if you want to help us keep winning this competition, a great way to do that, a cheap way to do that, an easy way to do that would be to subscribe to the channel and drop a like on the video. That helps it do better in the algorithm, and it will allow you to see when other videos come out easier. But if you would like to go beyond that, which you don't have to, but the option exists, if you want to be a real cool dude, like a real cool dude, then go ahead and check us out over on Patreon, where you can get access to a Discord with like-minded, reasonable, not dickish, asshole-ish basketball fans. We have good conversations over there all the time. You get access to video content from this channel early, including having discussions about what these videos are even about that you can participate in. I've been having a lot of fun with that. So go check us out over on Patreon if you would like to support us further. Also, that allows us to add more people to the team. And we have recently added Desmond Novak as an editor, as well as Lisco /Levia /Dario Saric girl / I don't know any other aliases, but she did research and fact checking. So great job from her. Really helped us a lot because that granular work is less fun for me. I just like to yap, and then she steers me in the right direction. Desmond does a great job selecting clips on the edit as well. But yeah, adding to the team helps. We should hopefully be producing more. I'm sitting in this office that we have right now, and it took a couple of months for us to actually get stable, both literally in terms of our location and mentally. But I think we're on pace to have a much higher level of output in the year of 2025, and we are going to be ramping it up to close this year. But yeah, that is it. Shout out to everybody who helped make this video possible, and shout out to you for making it to this point. Peace.